Literally and figuratively, watch me.
Pay me $10 million.
There's an advertisement about halfway through the Greta Gerwig movie, Barbie. The ad is pretty unashamed and overt in its presentation, with a style distinct from the film's principal aesthetic to make itself stand out. Both its cinematic and spoken language, the mise-en-scène, the music, yada yada, all come together in a way so harmoniously that if you took it out of the context of the film, it could still function as an ad. The Pride and Prejudice scene is one of Barbie's most representative moments. It's a microcosm of the mindset that informs its kooky cheek, but I'm actually describing the car chase sequence. It's not a secret that this was a Chevrolet ad. It was one of the first things I discussed with my friends after stepping out of the theatre, and we quickly concluded that it probably paid for a portion of the budget at the expense of some creative control on Gerwig and her crew's part. This is presumptuous, of course, but even if we exclude that idea, it is pretty clear that there is a contrast in how Gerwig sincerely represents Chevrolet, and that it is pretty hypocritical to the aesthetic sincerity of the broader text. Most films' product placements aren't particularly worth targeting because most of the time the products don't oppose the film's ethos. Barbie is a special case due to its apparent sincerity for interrogating the product and the concept of product placement. Today, I basically want to lay all of that out as bare and explicitly as possible for the sake of critique and record. This is not a video where I rag on Barbie or Greta Gerwig. This is not a video where I glaze Barbie or Greta Gerwig. Ew, I'm not saying that word again. I have no doubt that over the last year or so, several others have torn into the car chase sequence as well, but I want to use the scene rather as an opportunity to understand how advertising can be covert and overt, what metamodernism is, and how Barbie and other recent cultural phenomena in film and music and such are significantly successful and unsuccessful in detailing their aesthetic sincerity.
Last night I dreamt a new Bob Dylan song.
Today is June 30th and I am wearing this coat. Part 9-ery, irony. Where are all the previous parts? I ate them. Greta Gerwig's career since 2007 has been characterized by several distinct blocks, each represented by a duology. You have the Swanberg era, the Baumbach era, the directing Saoirse Ronan era, the big budget metamodernizing a famous modernist intellectual property, critical complacency, holy shit what's going on here era, and the upcoming Chronicles of Narnia films, of which we only know 2 to have been greenlit. All of Gerwig's films in one way or another showcase the philosophy of metamodernism. Metamodernism is an aesthetic movement, but is also more of a cultural descriptor, and I think really ramped up in the wake of Gamergate with its resultant propulsion of the mechanics of meme culture from the internet outwards into the real world as the real world became increasingly integrated with digital media. While certainly not a pervasive aspect of all of Gerwig's films, the most popular evidence of internet-driven metamodernism in popular culture is the changing function and contextual uses of irony. In a postmodern story, irony and sarcasm are used consistently throughout. By not taking the subject matter seriously, the author detaches themselves and the audience from it, and this better emphasizes the actual message of the story, which is usually the illumination of the contradictory aspects of the criticized.
One layer of irony is very boomer.
In a metamodern story, the author oscillates between or combines different layers of irony, and these layers sometimes frame each other. Barbieland's matriarchy is framed as an absurdity to highlight the absurdity, the hilarity, the stupidity of patriarchy. At the same time, Barbieland is an exaggeration of feminism. In a postmodern way, such exaggerative irony would mean that the author doesn't hold feminist values and is making fun of it. But in a metamodern, post-ironic way, it's making fun of women in a reclamatory sense, I think. Furthermore, the overwhelmingly shoddy state of the world makes talking sincerely about extremely serious and intricate goals like the dismantling of patriarchy a bit much to handle in spite of its necessity. So metamodern irony is, as well, providing an escapism from necessary sincerity without ignoring it.
True Blugulugulu is being happy within uncertainty.
We can discern a sincerity for feminism as likely the root intention under all of these different layers because Gerwig is a woman, right? There's a line at the start where lawyer Barbie says, "I have no difficulty holding both logic and feeling at the same time." On the surface, that is a feminist statement, maybe even a platitude. It's the truthful mediator between ubiquitous over-rationalism and its hypothetical, exclusively subjective opposites, affect. A conscious response to facts. Girly pop, why would you say this in a court setting? We know it. We've internalized it already. To retread it though is what's funny, and the tone of voice clues us in that Barbie knows too. This is an example of self-reflexivity. While the postmodern purpose of self-reflexivity would have been to explore the subjectivity and limitations of the order and medium in making that statement, metamodern usage of self-reflexivity, quote, provides a model for the reader's self-reflection and, by extension, the reader's own felt experience in receiving both the content and form of the text. Barbie Land's matriarchy exaggeratedly models the individual spectator's relationship to feminism. That quote is from Greg Dember's article titled 11 Metamodern Methods in the Arts. Dember is the editor for the website What is Metamodern and has appeared in several academic and non-academic publications discussing and defining the style. We're not going to use all 11 methods to identify Barbie's metamodernism in detail right now, or even the tenets I propose. Many are self-evident, and going through everything else would distract from the focus of sincerity's role in Barbie as an opposition to irony and artificiality. Oscillation, though, is an unignorably prominent element. With Sharon Rooney's line, Barbie isn't flitting or picking and choosing between sincerity and irony, rather both are happening seemingly simultaneously. The oscillation is happening so quick that to some it is impossible to tell what the sign is meant to be signifying. This is why the context of Gerwig as the director is so important. We'll put a pink bobby pin in that. Oscillation can be slow too. As a result, the difference between sincerity and irony becomes a lot more clear cut. The zoom on the fake wave to propose its danger is flatly ironic, and Barbie experiencing the gravity of human connection is flatly sincere. Part 10, art. Ificiality. I've just said sincerity may be opposed to irony and these are two separate dialectics. Now that we've sort of covered one, let's do the other. To put it really simply, artificiality in art is the breaking of trust with a receiver or consumer spectator of the made art object in a way that instills the sense in the receiver that the creator has not been guided by the need to communicate something transcendently incommunicable within themselves, to get something from in here out there. I don't even know if I understand what I mean by that, so let's try to figure it out.
Money is the last thing a person should be thinking about in my book. You fall in love with ideas and you get fired up and you go and you try to translate those ideas. It has nothing to do with any kind of career. It has to do with the loving of doing.
Whatever your talent is, just pursue it. You gotta love it though. That's the only way you're gonna pursue it, if you love it and you're not doing it for nobody else.
The need to communicate something transcendently incommunicable within ourselves is something I'm using to define what Associate Professor of the University of Utah, Professor C.T. Nguyen, describes as aesthetic considerations. I think it's something he leaves vague on purpose due to its intense subjectivity. In my perspective of the universe, it's the consciousness of the effect or resonance of art, which includes the important how such resonance is so profoundly propounded. Aesthetic considerations are, of course, intrinsic to the art making and receiving process. When I buy a painting because I think it's beautiful or dramatic, I am acting from aesthetic considerations. When I buy it simply as a good investment, or because it is the right size and thickness to cover a hole in my wall, I am not acting from aesthetic considerations. If you're going to buy a painting for the reasons that Nguyen describes as not aesthetic considerations, you're relying on the object based on the prediction that the object will physically do what is expected of it. The canvas could be blank, it could be a poster, it could be a grandfather clock or a fridge. It wouldn't matter. It's covering the hole in the wall, and based on the knowledge in your brain that the objects won't run away or fall over to specifically reveal the hole in the wall, you're relying on them to cover it, not because it looks cool. However, the aesthetic is not exclusive from other kinds of acts or dichotomous with non-aesthetic acts. I may put a poster up to cover a hole in the wall as a functional problem-solving act, but out of all the posters that could fulfill this purpose, the poster I choose may be out of aesthetic considerations. An aesthetic act within a non-aesthetic act. A second or third AD or a wrangler has to be hospitable to look after actors and make sure they're, keeping up with the shoot schedule. Someone has to write the shoot schedule. They are non-aesthetic acts within the greater aesthetic act of making the art object. Within reliance, Nguyen describes trust, a word and concept he uses to understand the translation and reception of aesthetic considerations.
I love being able to turn to people and like, what do you think? What do you think is the best one? I'll just give you exactly what they think, and it's like when you kind of have a trust with the community that's making it.
When you act aesthetically, that is when your choice of painting or garment or movie to watch is based on your personal fuzzy merits / interest, not from functional reliance. You're making a different kind of commitment, which could vary in stakes. You treat the object differently. Commitment to Nguyen is the entering of an active relationship with the trusting art receiver, the trusted art creator, and the creator's mediator art object. An art creator commits to making an art object as competently and as sincerely as possible, and an art receiver aims to interact with it as competently and sincerely as possible. We bring in commitments when we are attempting to actively structure practices of intentional cooperation. Cooperation to create the art moment, create resonance, create understanding. The relationship is as equally potentially explicit as it is potentially tacit too. I can trust people because I think they are committed to something. I do not need that commitment to make any reference to their care or regard for me, and I think this is characteristic of many of our aesthetic relationships. Relationships as we traditionally know them are born from the bearing of the soul, and this can happen in a myriad of ways. People that we personally know and trust personally may bear their soul to you, and they should make reference to the contextually bound limits of their care or regard for you. Artists that we aesthetically know and trust aesthetically may bear their soul to you in a myriad of ways, but they don't have to make reference to their care or regard for you. Parasocial relationships arise when you forget that last clause and mix personal trust with aesthetic trust, when you forget there is an object between you and them. Nguyen says trusting an artist via their art objects is relying on them to fulfill the commitment you believe they've made. Alternatively, there are processes of distrust where you don't rely on someone to fulfill the commitment you believe they've made, and non-trust where you don't rely on someone to fulfill the commitment you believe they've made because you don't believe they've made the commitment. Like, I'm not going to be mad or disappointed that my fridge isn't helping me understand the human condition because I don't believe that to be a purpose of the company that made it. For art to art, we must hold accountable actors in the relationship of Nguyen's commitments. We check to see if they are acting competently and sincerely. Nguyen's aspect in aesthetic competence is success in creating something aesthetically valuable. Is there a surface level resonance? Does it tingle your affect? As a proponent of the canon, does it intellectually stimulate you? Aesthetic sincerity, finally getting here, is one's motivation to be guided by their aesthetic considerations to communicate the thing that is within them. Aesthetic incompetence would then be making something that nobody really likes or responds to, and aesthetic insincerity is one's motivation to be guided by things that are not their aesthetic considerations. Obviously these exist in their own dialectics too. Someone will respond to something that no one else has responded to, maybe because no one else has responded to it. Maybe something is derivative in an interesting way. Maybe it is just derivative. Someone might restrain their aesthetic considerations out of fear, only partially getting at a wholly sincere sentiment. And of course these interact with each other too. Maybe insincerity is the key to expanding a particular canon, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Aesthetic insincerity is where we find artificiality. It's what I've been trying to understand the last 2 videos and the last 6 months of my life. If I had just read this paper, I would have saved a lot of labor. Let's pull out that pink bobby pin. When in 2021 or 22, film culture was told a big corporate schlockfest Barbie film was going to be happening, it let out an apathetic shudder. The news was unsurprising. It sounded kind of boring. Another toy made into a film to sell the toy. Great. We have had a long history of films like these that are not aesthetically sincere. Kids' films are possibly the most predominant in these kinds of debates. They might not teach the audience anything valuable about the long life ahead of them, or just repeat the same messages a million films have done before. They would look interesting if we didn't already have a million films that behaved and looked like them. Despite their derivativeness, people still see them because kids aren't aware of this history. We don't like The Boss Baby, The Emoji Movie, a spin-off TV series for a character in X Marvel property, etc., because they seem to prioritize profit over the commitments we believe they have made by making an object in a medium that so many art objects exist in, so many of the creating studio's resonant art objects exist in. This is the third part of Nguyen's conception of aesthetic trust, which he calls aesthetic steadfastness, the consistency in being aesthetically sincere and competent. Having Gerwig's name attached to Barbie shaped the reaction to its announcement from would-be flippancy to ambivalence. Gerwig had made a name for herself as an auteur. With the content of her original works and her adaptations, she's sincerely reflected on things about herself and culture. She's pushed an envelope in thoroughly, formally exploring metamodern methods in the arts. She has an aesthetic identity of sincerity and competence, thus a steadfastness too. Aesthetic trust in Gerwig shaped our perception of and confidence in Barbie. Trust in Gerwig outweighed our distrust for profit-guided IP adaptations, i.e. the pre-release idea of Barbie. For had it not, we may have felt, in Nguyen's words, betrayed. Nguyen isn't the only one to characterize the breaking of the commitment as deception. Agnes Guéraud is a musician and philosopher. In her book Dialectic of Pop, she likens artificiality to trickery. Sure, it's a broader kind of artifice, but I think it still applies to the artificiality coming from insincerity. It can be a source of discomfort in the context of an art that emphasizes the expressiveness of singular and situated individuals, and therefore a certain veracity of expression and a certain fidelity to the way in which expression naturally takes place. In a paragraph of his Critique of Judgment, Kant recounts an anecdote that sharply illustrates the naturalistic objection that could be made to all those pop voices that artificially manipulate our representations of the bodies that emit them. Visiting a country inn, says the philosopher, guests were delighted by the song of a nightingale, convinced that they had heard the trills of a small songbird, free of any human intention to please, to beg. Enchanted by the subtlety and perfection of this natural beauty, they were unaware that, in fact, the landlord had tricked them by hiding in a bush some roguish youngster who, with a reed or rush in his mouth, was able to imitate this song. Once this discovery is made, Kant says, no one will long endure listening to this song that before he had considered so charming. The revelation of trickery and artifice passing itself off as the natural and guileless renders the song unbearable. Pop fans sometimes express a similar kind of aesthetic disgust in relation songs that present themselves as natural, sincere, but which are then revealed to have been tampered with, i.e. an art sin has been committed in the making of the art. I find this more compelling than her conscious attempts to engage with artificiality. She does bring up the sincerity-irony dialectic, but the closest she gets to the sincerity-artificiality dialectic is her discussion of authenticity, which is not the same, but does contain sincerity. She writes about the etymological purity of a genre, classism's subsequent dilution, which reminds us of concepts like recuperation, and how the process was reflected in art criticism during the time of Bob Dylan and Chuck Berry. As soon as criticism became modernist, it no longer associated authenticity with sincerity or commitment, but with the need to have the sense of history, a consciousness of the zeitgeist. I interpret her use of sincerity as aesthetic sincerity, commitment as aesthetic steadfastness, and the zeitgeist as the transformation of form as aesthetic competence, I guess, where value is found regardless of its content, the grand narrative of the medium. Modernist arts criticism preferred formal development, and its canonical artists in this sense were defined by what they did to push the medium forward.
You've never seen The Godfather? This movie is a rich blend of Coppola's aesthetic genius and a triumph to Robert Evans and the architecture of the 70s studio.
That part is pretty postmodern, right? You've probably met many enthused art appreciators who mansplain with this logic to assert faux intellectual dominance, I guess. So an ironic representation is to deconstruct them. Barbie, however, also displays metamodernist art criticism in its sincere interrogation of history-making directors. Neither the supposed objective, bigger picture perspective or its rejection in favor of affect or vibes is prioritized. They coexist. Authenticity, or its lack of, also arises when Guéraud talks about the non-human, like singing robots, which follows up that passage about Kant. Guéraud's quote, artifice seems to focus on obscuring the form of a voice with auto-tune or a vocoder, rather than voice in the sense of content, like its sincerity or subject matter. When Baudrillard influentially proposed hyperreality as causing a confusion and conflation as to what signs signify, I think we've understood that we've made this blunder of focusing on signs' form and not science content as well. Form does house aesthetic considerations. It's where we can most immediately identify an artist's influences, for example. But content, a work's meaning, includes purpose, which includes fulfilling the commitment. I think in light of awareness of such a blunder, when responding to Barbie, people have focused on the opposite extreme, right? It's content rather than its form, which is good to do, and some have done both. Jessie Genders and Maggie Mayfish's videos rule. Don't expect me to speak on Barbie's content, listen to them. To echo the discourse's conclusion though, Barbie suffers a cognitive dissonance. In an interview with the New York Times, Gerwig said she was doing the thing and subverting the thing. Leftist Barbie criticism understands subverting as a recuperation of power structure critique into status quo behaviors. The film oscillates between Gerwig is metonymus of her sincerity to explore Mattel, its legacy, and how ideas of artificiality have been put forth across film history. Mattel, on the other hand, is metonymus of their insincerity and reluctance to follow suit, because associating with insincerity for their product is not a good look. The in-text feminist criticism of Mattel seems paradoxical to the contextual knowledge that said critique is being facilitated by the very things it says suck. It is a product against the idea of being a product. Its content, therefore, seems aesthetically insincere. But aesthetic insincerity arises when the guidance is extrinsic, but not necessarily extrinsically motivated. If a painter paints a line there because it would make the painting aesthetically valuable, and they wanted to make the painting more aesthetically valuable for the sake of money, then they would still be engaged in an aesthetic act. Similarly, if they made a painting more aesthetically valuable in order for it to have a political impact, they would still be engaged in an aesthetic act. This is to say that your art still has to be conscious of its time, genre, and audience. I don't think Barbie's intended audience would appreciate it as much if it was inaccessibly hyper-experimental with monologues of feminism and artificiality over one enduring shot of hot pink, just like how Derek Jarman did with his film Blue over one shot of the color green. I mean, Barbie is deep, but it has to be enticing with visuals, performances, plots, etc. too. And, you know, these are good things about the film. Neither of these films are... Blue is better than these. Derek Jarman could get away with something so inaccessible with Blue because his audience was primed with the context of his, like, personal life and existing experimental work, guided by an intended political impact. There was a natural emergence of an audience based on the aesthetic value that he provided. In contrast, Barbie tries to be aesthetically valuable with the criticism against the product because there is a pre-existing market of criticizing the product. This isn't inherently bad. You are allowed to criticize the market, but when you are the market and you don't change, your criticisms are thinly veiled. It's not Mattel making these criticisms. It's Gerwig.
Any alliance between us must be regarded as a highly reprehensible connection.
I believe Mattel is guided by what is extrinsic to aesthetic considerations, like profit and other boring, devious things. Like a puzzle piece, this fits fine into Gerwig's motivations not to make money wholly, but to connect the labor of writing and directing a feature film to the value represented by money and also attention. A whole lot of attention. Gerwig knows it's ironic to show concern for the commodification of the narrow expectations of women. She knows it's ironic to propose anti-liberalism through an intellectual property that thrives off of the liberal guising or simply lack of recognition of white supremacy. She knows it's ironic to propose transcending a need for the product through an intellectual property whose goal is not even to sell a product, but to achieve the big numbers that selling a product would get them. She knows this is ironic, which is why she uses different layers of irony so prominently. We've seen this before in the early stages of hyperpop. Pop has long been the face of artificiality in music. That doesn't mean we regard it as bad and win notes. We can still enjoy it or perceive it as aesthetically competent. We just don't regard it as aesthetically sincere. When PC music started exaggerating pop's form to sincerely explore its limits, regardless of the genre's artificiality, listeners started to conflate PC music's art with the exaggerative language of irony. It's hard to believe that you'd want to take seriously songs that aren't even memes now, but long dead ones, like Sicko Mode and Last Resort. We believed hyperpop to be a damning critique of commercial pop. We were wrong, but we didn't feel betrayed because aesthetic competence and sincerity remained. Artists like Charli XCX love genres that recently have not been deemed aesthetically valuable, or they just don't care about what other people think of those genres. Even if your aesthetic considerations manifest there, you don't host a rave to communicate something transcendentally incommunicable within yourself. You host a rave for people to forget the world and release the energy that they get when they do drugs. That they've done because they want to forget the world. Okay, that seems cynical. There is art in the disc jockey, obviously, but like before the mid-2010s, the presence of the role of art in these spaces has weakened over time, or maybe was not always congruent between the creator and the receiver. For artists who are affiliated with or graduated from PC music, their niche is that realignment. To sincerely show that there is room to experiment, to push the envelope of aesthetic competence, to be yourself and to communicate the incommunicable, all in a genre that has gained a reputation of stagnation for lack of sincerity. Gerwig, not Barbie, appropriates artificiality both ironically and sincerely to tell a story. And what better opportunity to do it in the context of a great icon of artificiality that too has gained a reputation of stagnation arising from a lack of sincerity. Not sincerity for aesthetic commitment per se, but of placing feminist dialogue in children's play spaces. A commitment nonetheless. Part 11, the case study. I hope I'm pissing people off with this. A checkpoint summary of what we've done so far. Barbie's post-irony, where sincerity and irony coexist, makes it intuitively relatable to those whose lived experience intersects with Gerwig's. Barbie is
Authentically artificial.
Authentically artificial.
Authentically artificial.
It uses forms of low sincerity akin to artificiality in order to explore itself sincerely. To understand how Barbie oscillates to and from sincerity on both scales in the card chase, let's anatomize it and compare the sequence to other scenes that represent each of the car chase's constituent characteristics. It's a car chase advertisement. How do the cars in this scene compare to how cars are represented in the rest of the film? In the car chase, Chevrolets are stunningly clean. I'm fairly certain the color grading changes to make them and their urban environments look bright, slick and reflective, which is not dissimilar from other advertisements for this particular model, which we will discuss shortly. The subjects have a very dominant presence in the frame, always centered and in open urban environments to really let the lights shine off them. Compare this to other overcast exterior scenes in the same diegetic cityscape, like when Ken first approaches patriarchy. It's important to remember that the 1968 film Bullitt is mentioned in the script for the Chevy scene, which is notable for its own dynamic car chase. I've alluded that Barbie is a dense pastiche of cinema. The famous opening score from 2001 looms behind that just mentioned Ken scene, for example, and the brightness of San Francisco appears directly pulled from Bullitt specifically. But that's as far as the exploration goes, it seems. The action is not nearly as grimy or immediate as in P.T. Yates's crime thriller. The Bullitt's chase beats cars up, they scrape against the walls, lose parts, slugs ricochet off windscreens. The suspension systems are not strong enough to prevent the bottoms of the frame clanging against the asphalt when they mount the road's steep declines. The cars in Barbie's chase scene are not subjected to this sort of brutality, for that would represent the Chevrolet as potentially fragile. The most it does is dramatically knock over some cones and bounce off a curb and cool? I guess? Danger is diluted when translating it from Bullets to Barbie, despite Barbie's script calling for crazy turns and smashing into the side of the median strip. This scene has to sell the dignity, agility, and strength of the product without the covert prestige of visually disagreeable battle scars. The film doesn't have to worry about this with non-Chevrolets, but every car in this scene specifically is a Chevrolet. The good guys have them, the bad guys have them, the innocent onlookers grueling through the commute home have them. Everyone in California seems to own a Chevrolet. Barbie and Ken in Barbie Land do not have Chevrolets. The presence that these cars have in their respective scenes are directly contrasted by the influence that the Chevrolet has on the mise-en-scène of its own scene. Stereotypical Barbie's Corvette is not its movement, because it is meant to be a representation of a toy car. The slapstick flip at the end of the act emulates the gross dexterity of a small child and showcases some of Barbie's ironic exaggeration. Meanwhile, Ken's Hummer, which I believe to be product placement if only less influential, also isn't given the opportunity to flex any of its strengths. In fact, it is subjugated as a mere prop on which Ken stands and slides around on. Whee! Sure, the Corvette and Hummer are not getting shot at or being chased at all for that matter, but they nonetheless aren't obligated to receive the same highlighting treatment as the Chevrolet. They are elements of the set and scene that supplement the immediate action and its actors. The Chevrolet, meanwhile, is the actor. Let's talk about the chase aspect in comparison with the preceding scene where the Mattel executives chase stereotypical Barbie on foot. This is where the absence of Goig is most noticeable, mainly because you can watch her vanish in the moment the on-foot chase ends and the car chase begins. Goig is constantly undercutting the reality of Barbie Land by reminding us of its artificiality, and the film's tongue-in-cheek nature comes in artificiality's lack of diegetic recognition. To the Barbies and Kens and Alan, it is merely real reality to them. Barbie Land, or whatever you'd call the place your toys existed in, was a simulation of the real world, so we imagine all the gaps that the toys cannot afford to. Goig, set designer Sarah Greenwood, as well as the additional myriad of designers and decorators, take this to the next level with Barbie Land. The background of Barbie Land is meant to represent the sky, but is not meant to stand in for the sky. It's like the Truman Show. The walls are real, and I'm in them. Maggie Mayfish briefly mentions the cinematographer's use of Kubrickian Palladianism to accentuate, to paraphrase Goig, tangible artifice. Palladian shots composition is meant to depict a careful, precise orchestration of the reality of the film with its symmetry and rigid shaping. At first, we may read this as a homage to Kubrick, but the more it pops up, the more Goig and co give themselves opportunities to transcend Kubrick's intentions with it.
He's also the paragon of a certain type of, masculine filmmaking, and it just felt like what a fun thing to sort of transpose with respect to this doll.
I've gone through all of this to say that Goig's aim of transposition not only dictates Barbie's cinematography for the on-foot chase scene, but also the choreography. There's a domino or butterfly effects going on because the choreography is tied to the sound design, which influences the soundtrack curation and their interplay. I love how the executive's boots hitting the floor is incorporated into the beat of Speed Drive. Keep this song in the front of your mind. Palladian shot comp permeates the on-foot chase scene. It houses the action. It's like a three-dimensional Scooby-Doo door gag. It's Wes Anderson if he was cyberpunk. It's cool! It's cool! The convention remains when we get a moment of rest, meeting Ruth for the first time, with lead gaffers Manny Tapia and Simon Finney, or maybe the visual effects artists in post, tapping into even Barry Lyndon's interior lighting, mimicking the 18th century paintings that film was inspired by. Kubrick is everywhere in this film, yet the consistency of this geometricity disappears between our two scenes.
I have my key cord, Come on!
The closest we get is during maybe my favorite line of the whole film.
I gotta lose these chuckleheads.
Oh, maybe my favorite line is
Sublime!
They can tie. This is meant to be one of the times the Chevrolet Blazer SS EV makes a crazy turn. Also, note the change in soundtrack. Charli XCX's Speed Drive, which was commissioned for this film, was written with the intention of backing the car chase, but that's not where it ended up. It's behind the on-foot chase scene now. Oh, the song they use instead is called Lose These Chuckleheads. That's amazing. It's on the score for the film, not the original soundtrack. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but most of the songs in the Barbie soundtrack are a pastiche of pop's past, just like how Goig fraternizes with the history of her own medium. Speed Drive instrumentally remixes Robin and vocally interpolates Tony Basil's Mickey. Nicki and Ice Spice sample Aqua's Barbie Girl. Swirling strings make Dua Lipa's Dance the Night seem original, but it retreads her song Levitating down to the It Happens that Levitating and much of the record it hails from also tastefully repurposed borrowed ideas from its genre's history, oscillating between future and nostalgia. Even though this purpose might not traditionally be an aesthetic consideration of every artist that appears on the soundtrack, at least it makes the songs seem crafted with intention, and we can see how an artist might express themselves under Goig's and Mark Ronson's guidance. I can't say there's a distinct identity to Lose These Chuckleheads. It sounds corporate, inoffensive, adaptable. I can imagine it fitting just as well under like a Subway ad or something. The only people I've seen recognizing this song on Twitter are people shazamming it and Mark Ronson, who made the song. On the flip side, Charli XCX feels like the perfect candidate for writing a song for this film.
You have these moments where you're like, no one can touch me, and then literally like 24 hours later you could be like, no one cares about what I'm doing. What's the point? And this album really taps into the kind of pendulum swinging from both of those feelings.
To paraphrase her, Charli XCX chose the car chase because it fascinated her and it was unconventional compared to something like the title credits. And while I don't think she's being particularly aesthetically sincere on Speed Drive, at least she's implementing her interests and building on her brand image. And functioning to accentuate action, compared to Speed Drive, Lose These Chuckleheads is invisible. How much the score and soundtrack engage engage with their respective considerations is directly proportional to how much the scenes engage with Gerwig's aesthetic considerations, which probably determined their curation and presence. Somewhat aesthetically creative song? Creative scene. Not very creative song, not very creative scene.
It's time to run out and get the new depression.
Comparing the ad-like qualities between the car chase and the more overt Depression Barbie Pride and Prejudice sequence at the end of the second act, one takes advantage of its consciousness of the structure of an ad, whilst the other plays itself completely straight in order to obscure itself. For the former, this lends to Barbie's irony, artificiality, and therefore sincerity, and for the latter, it overlooks it. Underneath tone of voice, there's a metamodern practical shtick in aiming to signal self-awareness in dialogue by over-elaborating lines without diluting meaning or intensity. Sitcom The Goldbergs does this a lot.
Starting now, stay away from the following Barry Goldberg trademark hobbies and interests: Globetrotter, karate, bow staff, Air Jordans, competitive kiting, extreme BMXing, hot showers, conga line, and diving into an icy river with a knife in your mouth. I also claim Skittles and soda. I also own roller skating, eating chili, half and full Nelsons, Chuck Norris, and boobs. No! You did something nice for Mom, so you suck.
Love you, Mama.
It thinks explaining the scene or character relationship is funny. It knows it doesn't have the capacity to show, so it tells. And tells. And in Barbie, the self-referentiality, lack of conciseness, and elongated lines stilt and so subvert the natural Gricean pace of conversation. And this is intended to be funny.
I know I'm stereotypical Barbie and therefore don't form conjectures concerning the causality of adjacent unfolding events, but some things have been happening that might be related. Bad breath this morning, a cold shower, burnt waffle, and falling off my roof.
I've never seen this kind of malfunction before. You know, you're gonna have to visit Weird Barbie.
She's fated to an eternity of making other Barbies perfect while falling more and more into disrepair herself. That and we all call her Weird Barbie, both behind her back and also to her face.
The Depression Barbie ad also does this, making sure to flout the same conversational rules of clarity and quantity. The narration overloads us with information. Yes, it's broken up with punctuative gaps, probably because it would be difficult for a child to say this as one sentence, as the script prescribes, but each segment is led with a conjunction, tying them together so it still feels like a single sentence. While, and, until, all in one go. Then you've got a heavy J-cut into the Pride and Prejudice cutaway, so there is no breathing room. So a J-cut is when the audio or the next shot precedes the change into the shot, and this is normally for purposes of conciseness, plus probably something to do with how the speed of light is faster than sound. I don't know.
She spent 7 hours today on Instagram.
I figure pointing out the irony of the ad's jovial tone in spite of the relatable darkness in becoming a husk of yourself is too obvious. Like, that's the joke of the scene. With its emphatic plinky major keys, liminal space set design and costume, so common in stuff like ads or stock photos, the sequence makes known the artificiality of advertisements. I mean, that's the purpose of the whole film, right? To test out tangible artifice, to transcend the idea or brand that an ad sells you. Stereotypical Barbie's journey is overcoming the image of the object, so easily manipulable to seem wondrous and alluring, and becoming a subject with autonomy. She reifies herself. There is no absurdity or adverseness to the connotations that the car chase brings to its product. Maybe one instance verges on the aforementioned style of breaking conversational norms, but mostly the dialogue is centered on the immediate plot and characters here. Dialogue of the Depression Barbie spots draws attention to the constructed idea of the product it is supposed to be selling, and the car chase understandably maintains attention to the constructed idea of Barbie. The difference is that this scene is essentially not selling her with the studied film language, it's selling the Chevy. Respectively, Barbie the film and Barbie, Margot Robbie's character, figuratively and literally take a back seat for us to look at the cars instead. The chase doesn't deconstruct car advertisements to highlight their artificiality through exaggerating or transposing features of the product with a thematic contrast. Instead, it is merely constructive. Corporate multimodal literature, like stock photos and advertisements, often decontextualize their subjects from a particular time and space, away from naturalistic, empirical truth in order to appeal to the connotative, abstract truth and, at the same time, the sensory, emotive truth. The targeted consumer spectator can then, therefore, appropriate the presented space as suitable to their subjective reality. San Francisco here is bland, not just because of the blaring reflective beige of its concrete, but because there are no incidental people, animals, technology, or services to make it seem lived in. There is one shot of Gloria turning into a back road where the extras and notably company names are 1. On-screen screen for less than a second, and 2, so unremarkable in name and style, you wouldn't be able to gauge what service they provided anyway. Location titles that are on screen for more than a second are the same, like National City Bank and Ocean Boulevard. California Bank of Trust appears too, but in all 3 of these examples, the emphasis of the car makes it unlikely you'll pay attention to the background anyway. When you Google San Francisco, you get images of the Golden Gate Bridge, its iconic steep roads, the Transamerica Pyramid, its trams and beaches. I only always knew about the first 2 because I played Ben 10 on the DS. They were incorporated into the platforming design of the San Francisco level. The car chase actively avoids identifying with San Francisco, so it isn't connotative of the Chevrolet Blazer SS EV. Even with the Golden Gate Bridge on its cover art, Ben 10 Protector of Earth transcends this connotation because in the text, the characters travel all over the US. The same can't be said for the Blazer in the text of Barbie. It must be the only subject matter visually present, so its contextlessness can allow reformatting for overt advertisements with the same purpose. There's one specialized ad where Chevrolet filmed the Blazer with some NASCAR drivers that fascinated me for completely different reasons. At one part, they increase the focal length during the shot, so the car transforms like it's made of goop and not metal and plastic. Inspired choice from the DOP. It disorients and disgusts me. Don't do it again. I said don't! No disrespect to the DOP either. They actually have some really engaging shots in here too, like when they're tilting the camera during a turn and we get all up in the face of the Daytona logo.
What a ride!
Wait, what was that?
What a ride!
This is what performance sounds like.
I turn to drive.
The NASCAR drivers clearly aren't experienced actors. They never wanted to be, but they really highlight the artifice of the advertisement. It's a perfect microcosm of what makes the Blazer product placement in Barbie stand out. Chevrolet has too many boxes they need to tick, so they forego the cohesive normalness of the text. In the NASCAR spots, they forego naturalistic dialogue by paying big faces to recite simple self-appraisal. In Barbie, they forego Gerwig's intentional visual language by getting the car at the angles and in the sets that they deemed most appealing. Maybe that's why Charli XCX liked it, because like her, Chevrolet just did their own thing.
Bitch, I'm just a girl. I keep everything pink like Barbie world.
The conclusion from my experience with Barbie was
when I see certified, I'm a rock and swerve.
I found a lot of value in Gerwig's homage to Bullets with the choice of set and colour grading in the car chase because it supports the cohesion of an overarching formal purpose, but then the convenience of its grading and the lack of any life in those sets aligning with marketing materials pushed back against the appreciation I want to have. They were the proverbial roguish youngster with a reed or rush in his mouth. Are we splitting hairs here? Or is this kind of detailed distinction necessary to properly get at why things add value to each of our own cinematic knowledges? Detail is useful sometimes, and I think this lends to the objectivity argument in arts critique. Not that the critique or conclusion is objective or authoritative, but the supporting evidence and its specificity. Barbie manifests a feminism of value, and we can point to specific examples. Additionally, objectively, Barbie manifests a whiteness, a cisness, or a narrowness in another sense that deserves critique. We are aware of detail's necessity. There is a continuum of people for and against it. And regarding length in which deep critique may come about, I don't think long critique is deep critique, but deep critique often necessitates length. I like Barbie for Gerwig's sentiment, but I also think that sentiment is flawed, regardless of Mattel's sentiment. To pick at the nitty-gritty and unfold it, to lay it out as bare and explicitly as possible might be the most optimal way to understand a text's politics, or its sincerity, or its meaning. But some people don't want to do this. You've probably seen reports that Mattel is considering other adaptations of its toy lines in the same vein as Barbie. What? Why? Barbie critique talks as if Mattel has usurped creative control from Gerwig, or was pulling her strings like some benevolent puppet master, because in context, it seems to have been the case for many previous profit-guided IP adaptations. Companies will rinse an art object until the essence that made it resonant is wrought out, which is why we have conceptualized aesthetic insincerity. Gerwig used Barbie to frame an intelligent story. She breathed new life into Barbie, both diegetically and in real life. Regardless of its happenstance release date, we may have come for its recognizability, but we would have stayed for, returned to, be compelled by the story itself. Gerwig, Baumbach, the hundreds of crew members, their souls, their aesthetic considerations. It might be obvious, but I think this news breaking was more of a marketing ploy than a commitment. Mattel had not been so culturally relevant for a fat while, so why not distribute the attention towards its other properties, even if only superficially. We know a lot of mega corporations don't hold a sincerity aesthetic or not for what their products represent or for the value they provide. Among the swathes of corporate and aesthetic insincerity, plus the general original purpose of social media, performing candidness, as paradoxically as that sounds, is increasing in presence online, and has been for a while. Mattel either outright told or merely co-signed Gerwig's scathing criticism to air such an image of candidness. It thinks transparency is the same as sincerity, and here we return to the idea of meta-performativity. Is instead the apparent transparency of Gerwig's creative control part of Barbie's marketing? I don't think so. I think she was just sincere with her story. But will an apparent transparency for a trusted auteur's creative control become a part of future films' marketing? Which is why we need to remain vigilant in properly explaining which details we take as aesthetically sincere and which we do not. It's possible whoever was responsible for the creative direction of the car chase scene didn't liaise with Gerwig about the film's intentional visual language. And if it was Gerwig who solely headed this scene, then she didn't do a good enough job to properly mesh it with the rest of the film, even though the implementation of its dialogue and soundtrack in the edit evidently did try. Largely though, by ignoring the purposes of Barbie's formalism, the car chase scene ignores a lot of Barbie's art. And in my ignoring of Barbie's philosophy and politics, I'm not assuming a position that's against criticizing it. It doesn't matter whether the film intends feminism or not. Ultimately,
my frustration is not with Barbie, but how Barbie is a reflection of our current cultural conversation.
A lot of people understand Gerwig indeed is the orator, not Mattel. Their criticism coexists with this background. I'm just bringing it up because I haven't seen anyone else bring it up, and I don't want people on the off chance to engage with Barbie discourse that has now long gone and faded away, but I mean retrospectively, without the context of rhetorically utilizable aesthetic sincerity. Here's a thought experiment. Barbie uses the form of aesthetic insincerity, of artificiality, sincerely, ironically, and post-ironically, not to poke fun or show the constraints of the medium or the product, but to stretch them, to test the limits of abstraction that a receiver can handle. You could say this is most obviously vehicularized in Barbie's differentiation between idealist and materialist societies.
It felt like really creating a fantasy world of something that was, I don't want to say perfect, but there's a sort of idealizing of it.
Because so much of Barbie is obviously ironic and therefore sincere in its criticism and in its critique of Mattel, the bluntness of its sincerity for Chevrolet stands out. The sheen of post-irony disappears. As a result, there's a metatextual, dramatic irony in how sincerely it promotes the idea of the Blazer as a product, despite the thesis of Barbie, which is literally about overcoming that. Last night, I dreamt of a new Bob Dylan song. It was one he always meant to write, but never got around to making. He listed all the horrifyingly newly commercialized street corners of New York, London, and Paris, Tribeca, Hudson Yards, Bedford Avenue and 7th, Rue Charlot in the Marais, that canal that's in East London. All these places had huge wheat pastes promoting his new album. It was a black and white photo of his face with big text that said Dylan. It was right next to an ad for the new Jack Harlow Bowl at Sweet Green. He thought about making a song about these places in an effort to prove to the listener that all art eventually becomes a part of the machine, that everything transgressive is bought and sold as a commodity, that being transgressive is the least punk thing you could be, and maybe even the most punk person on the block is Jack Harlow, smiling on a billboard, happily eating his custom salad from Sweet Green. Maybe it's cooler to not have that tattoo from that huge studio on Rivington, that one right by the plant store that sells Monstera plants for $70. Yeah, that's where they're promoting Dylan's brand new album. He's pissed about it. He's not happy at all. He still has an excellent radar for who's cool, who's a poser, who's a ripoff, who's a dreamer. He hasn't forgotten the beats, the lessons he learned along the road, but when he's in his Uber Black to Electric Lady Studios on 8th Street, he passes the newly condemned McDonald's that people only used to use as a bathroom. He passes the Blank Street Coffee and gets nauseous, because right outside that Blank Street Coffee on the sidewalk is a massive ad for his brand new album. He wants to stop the car, walk up, rip it off the walls, sink his nails into the chipped green paint of the construction board behind it, tear it all to shreds and shed a tear about where did he go wrong. In his head he screams, is this what success is? To have your album promoted right by the Blank Street Coffee where there used to be a cool stoop that you smoked cigs on? Tribeca, Hudson Yards, Bedford Avenue and 7th, Rue Charlot in the Marais, that canal that's in East London. Tribeca, Hudson Yards, Bedford Avenue and 7th, Rue Charlot in the Marais, that canal that's in East London. Tribeca, Hudson Yards, Bedford Avenue and 7th, Rue Charlot in the Marais, the canal that's in East London. Tribeca, Hudson Yards, Bedford Avenue and 7th, Rue Charlot in the Marais, the canal that's in East London.